It's being called the worst air disaster in this nation's history. This afternoon's crash of a DC-10 jetliner packed with holiday travelers. The plane plunged to the ground just yards from a trailer park. All those aboard the plane perished, and tonight...
Well, there's not much left. A few pieces of metal here and there, indications of the fuselage perhaps, or the tail. There are no survivors. No survivors.
You are listening to Inside the Black Box. This is the story of American Airlines 191.
Pull up! Pull up!
At just before 3 p.m. on May 25th, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 begins to push back from Gate K5 at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. The airport is very busy. It is the Friday before the Memorial Day long weekend, and many are travelling to be with their families or going on holiday. The aircraft chosen to fly this route, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, is at capacity, carrying 258 passengers and 13 crew members. American 191's destination is Los Angeles, California. In command of the aircraft is Captain Walter Lux, aged 53, a veteran pilot with more than 22,000 hours flying experience. Supporting him is First Officer James Dillard, aged 49, who has more than 9,000 hours flight time. He will be piloting the aircraft this afternoon. Finally, completing the crew is Flight Engineer Alfred Udovich, aged 56. Before the introduction of advanced electronics, a flight engineer was the third member of an airline's flight crew, tasked with monitoring, operating, and fixing an aircraft's systems while in flight. The DC-10 is a complex aircraft with 3 engines. 2 are mounted on the wings, while 1 is mounted on the tail of the aircraft. This configuration, known as a trijet, was very popular with US airlines during the 1970s and 1980s. It offered a compromise in size and range between larger 4-engined aircraft such as the Boeing 747 and smaller twin-engined aircraft such as the Airbus A300. After pushing back from gate K5, the pilots begin their taxi to runway 32 right. As the crew travel across the busy airport, they complete their final pre-flight checks on the move so they can take off as soon as they arrive at the runway. This is known as a rolling takeoff. It is Flight Engineer Udovich who reads through the aircraft's checklist, while Captain Lux and First Officer Dillard perform the necessary checks. At 2 minutes past 3, the aircraft is approaching the runway, and Chicago's air traffic control gives American 191 clearance for takeoff. Captain Lux acknowledges the tower's instruction. It is the last time anybody will hear from American Airlines 191. The DC-10 turns onto runway 32 right. Immediately, First Officer Dillard orders the aircraft's engines to take off power. Captain Lux pushes the engine's throttles forward, while Dillard rests his hands on them should he need to abort the takeoff. Meanwhile, Flight Engineer Udovich sits behind and in between the 2 pilots and monitors the 3 engines' performance. The 3 General Electric CF6 engines roar to life, and the 170-ton aircraft begins to lumber down the runway. Captain Lux calls out 80 knots. First Officer Dillard checks his instruments to verify they are also reading 80 knots and confirms. The aircraft continues to accelerate. 15 seconds later, Captain Lux announces V1, the speed at which First Officer Dillard must decide whether to continue or abort the takeoff. 2 seconds later, the DC-10 reaches VR, the speed at which Dillard may climb or rotate the aircraft. First Officer Dillard pulls back on the control column and the aircraft begins to pitch up and leave the ground. Suddenly, the crew hear a loud thump. Dillard shouts, "Damn!" 2 seconds later, the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder stops operating. From this point onwards in the flight, we We do not know exactly what happened in the cockpit of American 191, but we do know what the crew experienced. The readings for the aircraft's number 1 engine, which sits on the left of the aircraft, dropped to 0. Captain Lux's flight instruments all stop functioning. An array of lights illuminate, indicating problems with the DC-10's hydraulics and electrical systems. Recognizing that the number 1 engine has failed, and in accordance with his training, First Officer Dillard increases the angle of climb from 10 degrees to 14 degrees in order to gain altitude more quickly. Although the aircraft's speed will reduce, the DC-10 has passed what is known as V2, the minimum speed for an aircraft to fly with one engine not operating, so this should not be a problem. Approximately 20 seconds into the flight, and at only 325 feet above the ground, the crew becomes aware that the aircraft is beginning to roll to the left. First Officer Dillard counters the left roll by turning his control column to the right in an effort to maintain level flight. Despite his actions though, the aircraft's left bank continues to increase, and the DC-10 starts to turn to the left. Dillard applies even more control input, but no matter how much opposite aileron he applies, the left bank starts increasing by about 4 degrees every second. Simultaneously, the nose of the DC-10 begins to drop. Dillard pulls further back on the control column to raise the nose, but this does not seem to have any effect. The aircraft's pitch keeps dropping, and the aircraft starts to descend from only 325 feet. The bank of the aircraft has continued to increase and is becoming very steep. It would have quickly become obvious to the passengers aboard that something was very wrong. 27 seconds after taking off, the aircraft has rolled onto its side and is beginning to roll upside down while plummeting to the ground. 3 seconds later, the fully fueled DC-10 plows into the ground only 1,400 meters from the end of the runway, just in front of a trailer park. The aircraft is almost inverted, turns steeply to the left with its nose angled down. The wreckage, propelled forward, smashes into the trailer park in front of the aircraft. A fireball erupts into the sky, followed by a plume of smoke that can be seen for miles. Many fire trucks immediately started making their way to the crash site of American 191 without receiving any orders, knowing that something very serious had happened. Firefighters were initially told that a cargo aircraft had crashed, but upon arrival at the scene, it was obvious this was incorrect. Bodies and body parts were strewn across the field in what one investigator described as a sea of death. Firefighters found a field totally ablaze due to the large quantities of aviation fuel the aircraft had been carrying. While the firefighters had hoped to rescue any survivors, it quickly became obvious there were none. The 258 passengers and 13 crew members of American 191 are dead. 2 more on the ground have also perished. A further 2 are seriously burnt in the inferno which immediately followed the DC-10's impact. The following is a press recording taken very shortly after the crash.
Right in front of that fire engine, the first one that we see, there is now a tag with the number 1 on it. A small tag. It's a flag sticking up from the ground. Over maybe 10 or 15 feet to its right, another tag with the number 2. I'm told that those are identifying flags for the bodies. I'm starting to see quite a few of them around there. They may be...
The American National Transportation Safety Board GO team is dispatched to Chicago. When the team arrives, they waste no time in taking statements from eyewitnesses to the crash. One of those was the tower controller at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The following is a recording from the air traffic controllers as the disaster is unfolding in front of their eyes.
Look at this, blew up an engine, equipment, new equipment, he blew an engine by that guy. All right, American 191 Heavy, you want to come back into what runway? He's not talking to me. Yeah, but he's going to lose the wind. There he goes.
The individual who got the closest view of what happened to the DC-10's left engine was an American Airlines maintenance supervisor. He was waiting to cross the runway American 191 took off from. The maintenance supervisors saw what appeared to be vapor or smoke coming from the DC-10's left engine. He also noticed that the engine was violently bouncing up and down as it came closer. As the aircraft began to take off by commencing its rotation, the entire engine and the structure it was mounted to appeared to come loose, flipping over the top of the wing and falling away as the DC-10 continued to climb. Since the pilots cannot see the wings from the cockpit, it is very likely they were unaware of this happening, and most likely assumed they had simply lost engine power, when in reality, they had actually lost the entire engine. The aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered on the same day of the accident and are sent to the NTSB's headquarters in Washington, D.C. While the cases of the equipment are extensively damaged, both are functioning and provide useful data, but it is not the data the investigators are hoping to find. 2 days after the accident, on the 27th of May, the NTSB holds a press conference to announce that the cockpit voice recorder stops almost immediately after the left engine tore itself away from the DC-10. The initial area of focus for the NTSB is the most obvious cause of the crash, the separation of the left engine from the DC-10. Metallurgists combed the wreckage of the engine found on the runway and were able to locate the engine's mounting system. The structure had fractured in numerous places due to the forces from the engine tearing itself from the wing. These are known as overload fractures and occur when the metal is torn apart in a single event. But amongst the numerous overload fractures, the investigators discover something else. Fatigue cracking occurs when a piece of metal is weakened by being strained repeatedly. Microscopic cracks develop under each additional load, gradually weakening the structure until it eventually snaps. A quick explanation of the DC-10's engine mounting assembly is necessary before continuing. The DC-10 has 3 engines, 2 are mounted on the wings, and 1 is mounted on the center of the aircraft, on the tailplane. The engines on the wings are mounted on pylons, a structure which puts the engine slightly forward of and below the wing itself. The engine attaches to the pylon, and the pylon attaches to the wing itself via 2 internal bulkheads inside the pylon. These bulkheads manage both the weight of the engine, which weighs about 5¼ tons, and the forces produced when the engine is delivering thrust. The bulkheads are mounted to the wing using a clevis, a U-shaped piece of metal bolted onto the wing, and a flange, which fits inside the clevis. When a bolt is passed through the flange and the clevis, the wing takes the weight of the engine. The bolt sits inside a spherical bearing, which allows it to rotate easily. Notes on this assembly are included in the show notes. Investigators found the fatigue cracking on the rear bulkhead of the pylon structure. It appeared that the crack on the flange had become more and more severe until the flange had completely fractured under load. It was starting to become clear why the engine had torn itself from the aircraft. The flange, which attached the pylon and engine to the aircraft's wing, had been slowly weakened over time. Every time the DC-10's engine had been delivering thrust, the crack had gradually grown as the bulkhead assembly struggled to support the thrust and weight of the engine. On the day of the accident, the flange supporting the wing finally fractured. With nothing to support the engine on the rear of the pylon, the engine dropped. Aerodynamic forces and the thrust of the engine itself then caused the engine to flip over the wing and tear itself free. Further metallurgical analysis of the pylon bulkhead revealed something else. On the rear flange was a triangular dent. The NTSB were able to prove that the shape of the dent matched that of the clevis attached to the aircraft wing. There was no way this dent could have occurred while the pylon and engine were attached to the wing, and the investigators concluded that the damage must have been done before the day of the accident. The NTSB's attention turned to the maintenance of the aircraft. They determined that the particular DC-10 involved in the accident underwent maintenance on its engines only 8 weeks prior. The aircraft was brought to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to undertake maintenance activities recommended by McDonnell Douglas, specifically to change the spherical bearings used to mount the engine to the aircraft. The McDonnell Douglas Service Bulletin required that in order to replace the spherical bearings, the engine must first be removed from the aircraft. This is then followed by the pylon itself. After doing this, the spherical bearings could be replaced and the pylon and engine remounted. The removal of the engine and pylon was a long and complex process, so American Airlines had developed their own maintenance procedure in an effort to save time and potentially improve safety. Following the McDonnell Douglas recommended approach would require 79 electrical and hydraulic disconnections before the engine and pylon could be removed. However, by removing the engine and pylon as a single unit, the number of disconnections could be reduced to only 27. This approach also reduced the number of man-hours required to perform the procedure for each aircraft by about 200, which was a significant cost saving for American Airlines. The procedure called for a forklift with an engine stand to be placed under the engine and pylon assembly to support it. The bolts which attached the pylon bulkhead to the wings were then removed. The hydraulic and electrical connections were removed, and the whole assembly was dropped using the forklift. The spherical bearings could then be replaced, and the entire assembly would be reinstalled. Unfortunately, the operation to replace the spherical bearings on the DC-10, which would crash 8 weeks later, went far from smoothly. A night shift team began the work of removing the assembly, who were then replaced by a morning shift. The morning shift discovered that the forklift had not been properly positioned to support the engine and pylon assembly, so this had to be adjusted. The process could then continue. The technicians removed the rear bulkhead bolt first. This meant that the rear flange was free to pivot up and down and potentially be damaged by hitting the clevis. The procedure to refit the engine and pylon assembly was even more challenging. The forklift operator could not see the clevis on the wing, and instead had to be guided by another team member when maneuvering the 6-ton engine and pylon assembly into place. In addition, the forklift was very sensitive to control input. The NTSB found that the minimum distance the assembly could be moved at a time was about 6 millimeters. Although this might seem a small adjustment, the tolerances on the clevis mounting were minute. It is very likely that during the reattachment process, the forklift raised the engine and pylon assembly into the wing clevis, causing the dent on the flange, which would eventually turn into a fracture. The first stage of the investigation was therefore complete, and the NTSB understood the chain of events which led to American Airlines 191's left engine separating during the takeoff. But the question remained as to why the pilots had lost control of the aircraft and crashed. Although an engine separation or even an engine failure was rare, they need not have been catastrophic. American 191 had passed its V2 speed, which is the minimum speed required for the aircraft to take off should one of its engines fail. So what then caused the pilots to lose control of the aircraft and crash? Like the majority of commercial airliners, the DC-10 is fitted with slats and flaps to aid with the takeoff. Flaps are mounted on the rear of the wing and rotate down. Slats are mounted on the front of the wing and extend forward. Very simply speaking, the use of flaps and slats temporarily changes the shape of the wing in order to produce more lift. This is very useful when the DC-10 is taking off, because it means the aircraft does not have to travel so fast. Once the aircraft is in the air, the flaps and slats are retracted, which reduces drag and allows the aircraft to travel faster. The slats on the DC-10 are powered by hydraulic pumps. When the crew activates the slats, hydraulic fluid is pumped into rams, which then extend the slats. There are actually 3 separate hydraulic systems on the DC-10, which means that even should one system fail, another hydraulic system can continue to provide power as a backup. When the engine tore off from the wing, it severed several hydraulic lines. First, it severed the hydraulic lines of hydraulic system number 1, which was used to keep open 2 of the slats on the left wing. If the hydraulic pumps powered by the engine had simply failed, this would not have been a problem. Backup would have been provided by hydraulic system number 3, and the slats would have remained extended. However, the engine separation also caused the hydraulic lines of hydraulic system number 3, which ran parallel to hydraulic system number 1, to be severed. Hydraulic fluid began pouring from the aircraft's left wing. With no hydraulic pressure to keep the slats extended, the rushing air passing over the wing caused the slats to be pushed back and retract. Crucially, the hydraulic pressure was the only thing keeping the slats extended. There was no mechanical lock. Once the slats retracted, the left wing generated less lift than the right, and the stall speed of that wing actually increased. The NTSB could calculate that the stall speed of the left wing, without the slats extended, was about 6 knots more than the V2 speed the pilots were instructed to fly in the event of an engine failure. It was therefore clear what had caused the aircraft to roll to the left and crash. Following the separation of the engine from the wing, which the pilots believed was an engine failure, First Officer Dillard increased the angle at which they were climbing from 10 degrees to 14 degrees. This enabled the aircraft to gain altitude more quickly, but at the cost of speed, and the aircraft began to decelerate to V2, the speed at which the aircraft could safely fly with only 2 engines operating out of the 3. But because the slats on the left wing had retracted, it could no longer fly at the V2 speed, and stalled. First Officer Dillard did not take the necessary actions to break out of the stall by lowering the nose and increasing the aircraft's airspeed. The left wing remained stalled until the aircraft impacted the ground. Not reacting to a stall could perhaps be expected from an amateur pilot, but how did 3 highly experienced flight crew miss the onset of the stall and fail to take any corrective action? The issue can once again be traced back to the separation of the aircraft's left engine and the effects on the DC-10's electronics system. Much like the aircraft's hydraulic system, the DC-10 has 3 separate engine-driven generators which power different systems within the aircraft. When the left engine on American 191 tore itself free, it disabled a number of electronic systems in the DC-10's cockpit that would have thrown up a large number of warning lights. The most crucial systems which aided the pilots to operate the aircraft were the captain's flight instruments, the left stall warning computer, the slats disagree warning light, the stick shaker motor on the captain's control column. The cockpit voice recorder also lost power, which explains why the recording stopped 2 seconds after the engine separation. Looking at each of the electrical systems lost in turn, and their effect on the crew's performance, although Captain Lux was not flying the DC-10 during the takeoff, losing his instruments would seriously impede his ability to support First Officer Dillard by offering him information to tell him what was happening to the aircraft. The slats disagree warning is a system which is designed to warn the crew if one set of slats is extended on one wing while the other is not. If the crew had recognized that the slats did not agree, they could have retracted all of them and chosen a safer airspeed. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the left wing stall warning indicator should provide advance notice to the crew that the left wing was about to enter a stall. But because its power supply stopped working when the left engine detached, the pilots received no oral or visual warning that the aircraft was about to enter a stall. Additionally, the stick shaker motor, which is a system designed to violently shake the aircraft's control column to warn of a stall, was also disabled. So the pilots received no warning that the aircraft was to enter a stall until it was too late. The NTSB determined that the pilots likely did not believe they were in a stall in the first place, as they had received no indication this was the case. Flight Engineer Udovich could have restored power to the failed equipment during the flight, but this would have necessitated him unbuckling his harness, swiveling his seat, and standing up to activate emergency power within the aircraft. The NTSB did not believe this was attempted during the very short duration of the flight. The disaster of American 191 is a classic example of the chain of events which can lead to catastrophe. Looking at the three main factors which led to the disaster, the loss of the DC-10's left engine, the destruction of hydraulic system 1, the damage to the aircraft's electrical systems. Had each of these happened individually, the accident may not have occurred, but each problem built upon the other to make it almost impossible for the pilots to recover the aircraft. The NTSB undertook simulator testing after the accident. They were able to show that the aircraft could have still flown despite the extensive damage it received. However, the pilots were only able to control the aircraft when they were fully briefed of what was going to happen to the left engine. The NTSB did not believe that the flight crew's actions contributed to the accident. The NTSB's major recommendations to the Federal Aviation Administration following the accident were the provision of more stringent maintenance procedures. They also recommended more detailed assessments of system failures within an aircraft which could lead to its destruction. One of the NTSB's major recommendations was taking into account maintainability when certifying an aircraft was safe to fly. If the maintenance activities could potentially lead to an accident, such as they did with American 191, the NTSB recommended that the FAA did not certify an aircraft as being safe to fly. One of the greatest legacies of the disaster of American 191 was the impact on the reputation of the DC-10. A very famous photograph, which was actually used to determine the position of the aircraft slats during the accident, was taken by an observer, showing the plane banked sharply to the left, with hydraulic fluid pouring from the wings. This photograph was widely circulated in the media, both in the United States and abroad. In the initial confusion which followed the accident, the FAA grounded the entire DC-10 fleet 2 weeks after the incident, when it became clear that the damage to the pylon mounting system was not limited to the DC-10 which crashed in Chicago. Numerous other DC-10s were found to have damage to the pylon bulkhead. One aircraft, operated by Continental Airlines, was able to have its engine rocked back and forth because of the severe damage to the pylon. The FAA eventually allowed the DC-10 to continue flying in the United States when they determined that it was the maintenance procedures that were at fault and not the design of the aircraft itself. But public confidence in the aircraft had been shaken after American 191, and orders for the aircraft dropped dramatically from 1979 onwards. Production of the DC-10 was eventually discontinued in 1983. In the end, it was economics which killed aircraft such as the DC-10 and other trijets. More efficient twin-engined aircraft with more reliable engines eventually led to the downfall of the trijet. The DC-10 continued to be used by American operators until 2000 and international operators until 2014. The aircraft is still widely used by cargo operators around the world. Thank you for listening to Inside the Black Box. Please follow the Inside the Black Box podcast on Twitter at ITBB Podcast. That's India Tango Bravo Bravo Podcast. Thank you.